The signal came in on a frequency no human instrument was supposed to be able to read. Sergeant Yua Takeda heard it first, not through any console or receiver, but through the fillings in her back teeth. A vibration, low, sustained, the way the earth hums before a train arrives. She was standing at the window of the Erebus Station command post, watching the last light drain out of the Pacific, when the fillings started buzzing. She pressed 2 fingers against her jaw, frowned, and said nothing. In the 17 months she'd been stationed at Erebus, she had learned that the things worth worrying about announced themselves quietly. The explosion came 3 seconds later. Not outside. Not in the bay below. It came from the operations wing, a muffled crump, the sound of something pressurized giving way, and then the lights died and the emergency strips came on. That ugly amber that makes everyone look like they're already dead. Yua was moving before the echo finished. Her sidearm was in her hand. Her boots found the hallway by memory. She found Commander Hideo Sato slumped against the wall outside operations room. One hand pressed flat against a wound in his side, his tablet still glowing on the floor beside him. He was conscious. Barely. How many, she said. He shook his head. Not the kind of shake that means I don't know. The kind that means you don't want to know. She looked through the porthole window in the operations door. 3 of them inside. Tall. The word didn't do it justice. They were structured tall, like something that had been designed with height as a priority, with every other consideration arranged around it. Their limbs were too long and jointed in the wrong places, and the surfaces of their bodies shifted between what looked like chitin and something wet and iridescent, the way oil moves on standing water. They wore nothing. They needed nothing. One of them held in what passed for its hand the severed drive array from Erebus Station's communication core. Yua had read the classified briefs. Everyone at Erebus had. The Keth, the reports called them, though no one knew if that was their name for themselves or something one of the early contact teams had assigned in the chaos. They communicated through modulated vibration in the 12 to 18 Hz range. The frequency the human body feels but does not quite hear, the frequency that triggers unease in crowds, that makes animals flee before earthquakes. They had been choosing that frequency deliberately for years, inserting it below the threshold of human awareness into communications infrastructure. Broadcast networks. The ambient drone of city power grids. They had spent years making humanity anxious without knowing why, priming the herd. Now they were here in person to see what the priming had produced. Yua pressed her back against the wall. She looked at Sato. He looked at her. In the amber light, his face was the color of old wax. "Get up," she said. "I can't. I didn't ask if you could. I said get up." He got up. She took his arm across her shoulders and they moved. The evacuation routes from Erebus Station ran through 4 kilometers of tunnel, carved into the basalt shelf of the island, and Yua knew all of them. She had walked them in the dark as a drill, timed herself, memorized the handrail gaps, and the places where the ceiling dipped. She moved through them now with Sato's weight on her, and the sounds of the station going wrong behind her. Not alarms, because the alarms were dead, but the sounds of things being broken open. The wet resonance of Keth communication that she felt in her sternum more than heard, and occasionally, briefly, human screaming. She had been a soldier for 11 years. She had been in 2 ground engagements and 1 maritime incident, and she had believed, until approximately 22 minutes ago, that she had a reasonable understanding of what she was afraid of. She had not understood. She understood now. The tunnel emerged at the sea-level access dock, a concrete shelf where supply boats docked in better times. No boats now. Sato sat on the concrete and breathed. Yua stood at the tunnel mouth and looked up at the station, where lights that should not have existed moved through windows with a cold blue-white intensity. The color of something very hot or very cold, she couldn't tell which. The Keth's internal biology produced bioluminescence under stress. The briefs had mentioned it. It looked from below like the station was filling with stars. She pulled out her radio, dead. She pulled out her backup radio, also dead. She reached inside her jacket and found the thing she was not officially supposed to have. A shortwave transmitter that her previous posting signals officer had given her as a joke. An antique hand-wound, the kind of unit that operated on frequencies so old and so low that modern jamming infrastructure didn't bother targeting them anymore. She found the channel she wanted and keyed the transmitter. "This is Sergeant Yua Takeda, Erebus Station. Authentication code November 7 Foxtrot 002. Station is compromised. Keth presence confirmed. Minimum 3 contacts, probable more. Communications core is down. I have 1 wounded. I am requesting." She stopped. She changed what she was going to say. I am requesting anyone. Static, the Pacific dark. Sato's breathing, too fast, too shallow. Then a voice, somewhere between a growl and a frequency, said, received. They came in waves, which was not the word Yua would have chosen. Waves implied the sea. Something fluid, something that could be redirected. What arrived at Erebus Island did not redirect. It arrived with the logic of geological events. The first to reach her was a man she would later know as Daisaku, young, 20 at most, with a boy's face and a soldier's eyes, wearing the kind of field suit that looked like it had been assembled from 3 different military surplus stock. He came by inflatable raft from a direction she couldn't account for, which meant he'd been closer than the radio range should have allowed, which meant he'd been already moving before she called. He dragged the raft up onto the concrete shelf, looked at Sato, looked at the lights in the station windows, and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "How many do you think are in there?" "At least 3. Maybe more in the lower levels." "Do they know you're down here?" "Not yet." He nodded once, with an economy that reminded her of people who've been in enough bad situations that they've stopped performing calm and simply become it. 2 more arrived within 20 minutes. Ichitaro and Kenji, a pair who moved with the ease of people who have operated together long enough that they communicate in half gestures. Ichiro was built like someone who'd had his dimensions decided by a committee that prioritized durability over elegance. Broad through the shoulders, short in the neck, with hands that looked like they could break a car part. Kenji was the opposite. Lean, long-fingered, with a way of going still when something needed watching that Yua associated with snipers. They carried things she didn't recognize. Equipment that wasn't standard issue, that had the quality of improvised permanence. Built once by someone who knew exactly what they were building, and then never changed because it never needed to be. "Backup?" Yua asked. "Coming," Ichiro said. "How far out?" "Not far." It was the kind of answer that would have infuriated her 2 hours ago. Now she accepted it and filed it in the category of things she had to work with. What arrived over the next 40 minutes, through various combinations of watercraft, repelling lines, and one approach she would have classified as physically impossible if she hadn't watched it happen, was the thing she had requested: anyone. She had not expected anyone to be so many or so strange, or so clearly assembled from such different conceptions of what a person at the end of the world looked like. There was a woman named Rui who spoke only when something needed to be said, which meant she spoke perhaps a dozen words in the first hour, and every one of them mattered. There was a pair of brothers, Hiroshi and Jin, who finished each other's sentences, and disagreed constantly, and moved in the same direction at the same time without discussion. There was a man named Tetsuya who appeared to be in his 50s, with gray at his temples and a scar that ran from his left ear to his collar, who looked at the station and said very quietly, "I remember the last time," and did not elaborate. Yua did not ask him to. And then there was the last one, who arrived alone, who had no raft or line, who walked out of the water at the base of the dock, as if he'd been walking on the seafloor and had simply decided to stop. He was not young, but he was not old, and the only word Yua could find for the expression on his face, as he looked up at the Keth lights in the station windows, was professional. Like a man looking at a problem he had solved versions of before, and was now solving again. His name was Keigo. That was all he offered. It was enough. "They've moved to the upper deck," Rui said, looking at something in her hands that Yua couldn't immediately identify. A receiver of some kind, reading frequency she didn't have the equipment to see. "They're transmitting. We have maybe 4 hours before anything answers." "Anything," Yua said. "Whatever comes when they call." Yua looked at the assembled group on the concrete dock. 11 people. 12, counting herself. The station above them lit with alien bioluminescence, humming at the frequency that pressed against the human nervous system like a thumb on a bruise. She thought about saying something. Something that would cohere this collection of strangers into the shape of a unit. She opened her mouth and found that whatever she'd been about to say felt wrong, felt like a performance, felt like the kind of thing people said in training simulations. She closed her mouth. Kigo, who had been wringing seawater from the hem of his jacket, looked up and met her eyes. "You've done this before," she said. "Not a question. Different shape," he said. "Same math." "What's the math?" He tilted his head at the station. "There are more of us than there are of them. In there. Right now." He paused. "That won't be true in 4 hours," she nodded. "Then we go now." The plan, such as it was, had the virtue of accounting for what they actually had, rather than what they wished they had. No air support, no heavy weapons. One wounded man who had insisted on staying mobile despite everything, and who had proven himself worth, including when he produced. From a waterproof bag she hadn't seen him carrying, a schematic of every Keth sensor array they'd recovered from the 2 confirmed contact sites in the northern Pacific. Sato knew things. Sato had been collecting things to know for 17 months quietly, in the way that people in his position collect knowledge, when they've decided they will need it someday, and have no idea when. His day had arrived. He was pale and sweating, and he'd wrapped his wound with the sleeve of his own jacket. But he sat on a rock at the tunnel entrance, with his tablet propped on his knee, and talked them through the Keth's blind spots, with the precision of a man who has waited a long time to be useful. They navigate by vibration, he said. They don't see the way we see. Light isn't their primary input. They create a map through sound, sub-audible resonance bouncing off surfaces. If you disrupt the echo, scatter it, give it too many competing surfaces, they go semi-blind. Not fully, but partially. How do you scatter it? Rui asked. He reached into the bag again and produced a double handful of what looked like hexagonal metal tiles, each one smaller than a playing card. Each one with a surface that Yua recognized as diffraction grating, the kind of texture that breaks up coherent wave patterns. You stick these to every vertical surface in a 12-meter radius. It takes their echo map and turns it to noise. Kenji was already looking at the schematic. East wing access is the cleanest approach. Maintenance corridor, no sensor coverage for 11 meters past the junction. That's where they had the comms core, Yua said. That's where they're going to be, Kenji agreed. The briefing was 12 minutes long. It would have been shorter except Hiroshi and Jin spent 3 of those minutes arguing about which of them was going first through the junction. And the argument ended the way most of their arguments seemed to end, with both of them going simultaneously and making it work. Before they moved, Yua found herself standing next to Tetsuya, who was checking something on his belt with the careful attention of a man who has learned that the thing you didn't check is the thing that fails you. You said you remembered last time, she said. He didn't look up. Hokkaido, 2019, one of the first confirmed contact events. He paused. My daughter was 12. Yua waited. She drew a picture of them afterward. The ones she'd seen from the window of the gymnasium, where we'd taken shelter. He finally looked up. She made them beautiful. She didn't know what she was looking at, so she saw them the way a child sees anything she doesn't understand. Like they were a wonder. Were you angry? He seemed to consider this genuinely, rather than reaching for the reassuring answer. No, he said finally. I thought that's the thing they didn't plan for, that we do that. That a 12-year-old sees the thing that's coming to erase us and makes it into art. He holstered whatever he'd been checking. They didn't account for what we're like. And what are we like? He almost smiled. It was the kind of almost that carries more weight than the full version. Persistent, he said. Unreasonably so. The maintenance corridor smelled of seawater and burnt electronics and something else. Something that triggered the hindbrain, the part that predated language, the part that made the hair stand up on the back of the neck. The Keth scent was not a scent in the ordinary sense. It was more like the memory of a scent, something the body registered before the nose could. Cold ozone and something organic beneath it, something that did not belong to any taxonomy of Earth biology. They moved through the corridor in a line, each person's shoulder brushing the wall for orientation. Yua was fourth from the front. Kigo was directly behind her. He moved, she noted, with the particular quality of someone who had long since reconciled himself to darkness. The diffraction tiles went up as they progressed. Daisaku peeling them from the strip and pressing them flat against the walls with quick, sure movements, never slowing. Watching him work, Yua thought, he has done this specific motion so many times that it has become the thing his hands do without instruction. And she thought, how many times, and since when, and how old was he when this became the thing his hands know? She thought about Tetsuya's daughter and the drawing, and did not let herself look at it too long. At the junction, they stopped. Rui pressed 2 fingers to the wall and held them there for a moment. Reading the vibration, Yua understood, using her own body as a sensor in the way that Sato had described the Keth using theirs. Then she held up 3 fingers, changed it to 4. 4 in the room ahead, 4 against 12. The math was not on its face unfavorable, but the math didn't account for what the Keth were. The Keth had a capacity for violence that was not emotional, not strategic. It was functional, in the way that weather is functional, in the way that it does not want to hurt you, and therefore cannot be argued with or deterred. The two people who had walked into confirmed Keth contact zones and walked out again had both described the same quality. Not cruelty, not aggression, not even hostility, exactly. Indifference moving at speed. That was harder to fight than rage. Rage made mistakes. Rage could be baited and redirected. Indifference just continued. Yua pressed her back against the wall of the junction and breathed in, hold, out, the old pattern. She felt the vibration through the wall against her shoulder blades. The Keth signal, still broadcasting, still reaching out to whatever was going to answer in 4 hours. Or 3 hours and 40 minutes now. She looked down the line of faces. Daisaku checking his equipment with the same practiced motions. Rui, already focused somewhere beyond the wall, reading things the rest of them couldn't read. Hiroshi and Jin, making no sound, communicating in the micro-gestures of people who have been in hard places together and come out. Kenji at the front of the line, his posture carrying the particular stillness of decision. The stillness of someone who has already accepted what is about to happen and is simply waiting for it to begin. Tetsuya, who remembered Hokkaido, whose daughter had made art of what terrified her. Kigo, who had walked out of the ocean like it was a Tuesday. And Sato, pale, hurting, leaning against the far wall of the corridor 20 meters back, his tablet still glowing, still tracking, who had spent 17 months learning everything there was to know about how to fight something he had prayed he would never have to fight. 12 people, no backup, no cavalry, just this, Yua thought. This is what Tetsuya meant. This is the unreasonable persistence, not the weapons, not the training, this. 12 people in a maintenance corridor in the dark, none of them leaving, none of them waiting for something better than what they had. She exhaled. She looked at Kenji. He looked back. She nodded. He went through the door. What happened in the next 8 minutes would be difficult to recount in sequence, because sequence implies a kind of order that the operations room did not have. What it had was simultaneity, everything occurring at once, in the confined space, against 4 entities that responded to threat the way a system responds to interference, immediately, totally, without hierarchy. The diffraction tiles did their work. Yua could see it. The way the Keth moved in the first 2 seconds had the quality of absolute confidence. And then something shifted in the way they held their bodies. Something she could only call recalibration. The echo map they were navigating by had turned to static. They were not blind. They were still fast, still devastating, still capable of things that the human body simply wasn't. But they were now operating on incomplete information, and incomplete information, even for the Keth, created hesitation. Hesitation, Yubeg had been taught in her first year of training, is the crack in the door. What the 12 of them did with that crack was unreasonable. There was no other word for it. They should not have been able to do what they did, by any calculation based on the available data. But data doesn't account for Hiroshi and Jin moving as a single organism with 2 sets of hands. Data doesn't account for Rui's ability to read the vibration field in real time and call adjustments that arrived a half second before they were needed. Data doesn't account for Daisaku, who fought like someone who had been losing everything for years, and had arrived at the calculation that there was simply nothing left to conserve, and so committed everything, every time, without remainder. Data doesn't account for Kigo. She would think about Kigo later, in the debriefing, in the months after, in the quiet moments that are the real aftermath of violence. She would think about the way he had moved through those 8 minutes as if operating on a slightly different timeline from everyone else. Not faster, exactly, but differently timed. Like someone reading a piece of music who knows what's coming 4 bars ahead. She would conclude, eventually, that what she had witnessed was not superhuman. It was the far end of human. The thing that happens when a person has been in enough of these situations. Across enough years, across enough versions of this same problem with different shapes. That their nervous system has rebuilt itself around a new normal. It was not comforting. It was not supposed to be. It was, however, extraordinary. The 4th Keth fell at the 7-minute and 40-second mark. She knew the time because she'd been outing. The old habit, the one her first squad leader had drilled into her. Count the seconds in every contact. It keeps part of your mind out of the animal response and in the operative one. Silence after. The resonance frequency faded. The Keth bioluminescence dimmed and went cold. Yua stood in the center of the operations room and looked at what remained. At the people still standing. At the people checking each other for damage with the particular tenderness that comes out of violence the way the sea comes out after a storm. Unexpected, almost unbelievable, deeply necessary. She found she was still counting. Sato appeared in the doorway 12 minutes later, leaning on Tetsuya's shoulder, his tablet still glowing. "The transmission," he said. "Is it still broadcasting?" Rue was at the Keth communications array, the hardware they'd brought, assembled on the frame of what had been the Erebus comms core. She was looking at it with the expression of someone reading a language they learned recently and are still conjugating in their head. "Partial," she said. "They interrupted their own signal when they—" She paused, choosing a word. "When the contact ended, there's a carrier signal still running. Whatever they called is still looking for confirmation." "How long?" Yua asked. "Until it decides confirmation isn't coming. I don't know. An hour. Maybe less. Can you send it something?" Rui looked at her. "I mean, can you corrupt it, send it noise? Send it something that reads as static, or as nothing, or—" Yua stopped because she could see from Rui's face that she was asking about something Rui was already 3 steps into solving. "I can do something better than noise," Rui said. She was already working. What she did, in the next 40 minutes, with Sato reading from his 17 months of collected knowledge and Kenji running physical patches through the Keth hardware, with tools that were not designed for it, and Daisaku holding components in place with his bare hands because there was no clamp that fit was this. She sent back a signal that said nothing had happened. That said, "We are here, we are stable, we are not worth the transit." It was not, she acknowledged when she'd finished, guaranteed to work. The Keth were not foolish. Whatever was out there, whatever had received the original call, was older than this station. Older probably than anything humanity had built, and it would have seen more deceptions than she could enumerate. But it would be looking for an absence of signal, a cut-off call, the sign of interference. And what she'd sent it instead was something continuous, something coherent, something that had the grammar of Keth communication even if it said nothing of substance. Whether it worked would not be known for some time. These were the kinds of outcomes that revealed themselves across days and weeks, in the quiet arrival of something expected, or the continuing quiet of nothing. "We'll know when we know," Sato said, with the philosophy of the genuinely exhausted. They stayed on Erebus Island through the night. There was nowhere immediately to go. The only watercraft available were the inflatable, and one rigid hull the brothers had arrived in. And neither was provisioned for the kind of departure that would have made sense. And there was something else, something unspoken, that kept the group on the concrete dock as the sky lightened in the east. The particular reluctance of people who have been through something together, and are not yet ready to return to the world in which it didn't happen. Yua sat on the dock with her back against the station's seawall and watched the horizon. Kigo sat a few meters away, doing the same. "The drawing," she said after a while. He looked at her. "Tetsuya told me. About his daughter." Kigo nodded. "When I was little," she said, "my grandmother used to tell me that the most dangerous thing a person could do was survive something. She meant it as a warning. She'd been in situations, her generation had been in situations, where survival came with debts she couldn't describe. But," Kigo said because he could hear the but I think she was also describing something true in a different way. That when you survive something, you are carrying it, you are the record of it. And whether you want to be or not, everything you do afterward is going to be shaped by it." She paused. She thought that was a weight. "I think it's also an instruction." He considered this. He had the quality of someone who had thought about similar things for a long time, and had not resolved them, which Yua had come to understand, was different from not knowing what to think. "What's the instruction?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. On the water, the first light was showing, that particular blue-gray that isn't quite dawn, the light that arrives before the light that says, "Wait, it's coming, hold on. Keep making the drawing," she said. "Whatever you can see, whatever you understand, whatever you don't. Make the record." By mid-morning, 2 additional boats had arrived. Official vessels, the kind with agency markings, carrying people who were clearly expecting to find something much worse than what they found. The debriefers asked the questions that debriefers always ask, in the sequence that debriefers always ask them, and Yua answered them in the sequence they were asked. At one point, a man from an office she recognized by its letterhead as something with more authority than its name implied sat across from her and said, "You understand that this cannot be the permanent solution. 12 people, with improvised equipment." "I understand that," Yua said, "the scale of what we're potentially—" "I understand that," she said again. He stopped. He looked at her. He seemed to be deciding something. Then he said, "What would you need?" And she thought about the 12 people on the dock, about the things they'd each arrived carrying, not weapons, but knowledge. a specific accumulated understanding of this particular problem that could not be reproduced by a committee or generated by a training program. About Sato's 17 months of patient information gathering, about Rui's ability to read what the instruments couldn't, about Daisaku's hands, steady on the components, holding the thing together. Not equipment, she said. People, the right people. There are right people. There are always right people, she said. The problem is that they're usually scattered. They don't know about each other. They've each been solving parts of the same problem in isolation, and nobody has. She paused, finding the word. Gathered them, he said. Yes, he wrote something. She couldn't read it from her angle. She didn't try. Erebus Station will be classified as. I know what it will be classified as, she said. I don't care what it's classified as. I care about the 4 hours we had. I care about the fact that we had 3 hours and 40 minutes left when we finished. She leaned forward slightly. Next time we might not have 4 hours. Next time whatever they called might be close enough to confirm the silence. Next time we need to already be gathered. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, through the debriefing room's single window, the Pacific was calm and flat and exactly as enormous as it always was. All right, he said. The Keth did not return to Erebus Island. This was, over the following months, interpreted in several different ways by several different analytical bodies, most of which Yua was not permitted to read, and some of which she read anyway. The prevailing interpretation in the community she'd been quietly folded into was that Rui's signal had worked. Not perfectly, not permanently, but well enough, that whatever had been listening had received something sufficiently coherent to interpret as not worth immediate investigation, that it had, in the language of intelligence analysis, deprioritized the location. Whether it had deprioritized humanity was a different question, and one that nobody had an answer to, and one that Yua thought about on certain mornings, the way you think about a medical test you're still waiting on results for, present at the edge of every other thought. Not consuming, but there. She was reassigned. Not to a desk. Not to the kind of position that would have made administrative sense for someone with her background and seniority. She was assigned to the gathering. It was not called that officially. It had several names and several documents, none of which mattered. What it was in practice was the project of finding the right people. The Satos who had been quietly collecting knowledge for 17 months without telling anyone why. The Ruis who could read things the instruments couldn't. The Kigos who had walked out of the water and gone to work. Finding them. Not always telling them what they were being found for. Letting them continue the work they were already doing while building the infrastructure to bring that work together when it needed to be together. It was, Yua thought, the slowest and most important thing she had ever done. Daisaku joined her 6 months in. He arrived at her office. Not an office. A repurposed storage unit on the second floor of a building that officially did not exist, on an island that officially had a different name, with 2 paper cups of coffee, and the expression of someone who has been offered something they weren't sure they wanted to want, and has decided to want it. I heard what you're doing, he said. Heard from who? He shrugged with one shoulder. People talk. She looked at him, 20 years old, or near enough, with the hands that knew how to hold things together, and the eyes that had already seen enough versions of the worst thing that they'd stopped being surprised by it. What did you hear? She asked. That you're building something. For next time. For the time after that too, she said. And the time after that. He considered this. He put one of the paper cups on her desk. He didn't sit down, not yet. He was still deciding. What happened to Kigo? He asked. He went back to what he was doing before. She paused. He's on the list. Of course he is. Daisaku looked out the window. The view was of the ocean. There was always ocean, on all of these islands. And in the flat gray afternoon light it looked like hammered metal, like something being worked into a shape that would be revealed later. You know they're going to come back, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, with more. With something that doesn't get disrupted by diffraction tiles and a jury-rigged transmission. Probably. And we're going to. He stopped. He was working out the logic. Yua could see it. Running the calculation. Arriving, as everyone who ran this calculation honestly arrived, at the point where the numbers were not comfortable, where the gap between what they had and what they might need was wide enough to be frightening, and then arriving, as she had watched every right person arrive, at the thing past the fear. Okay, he said. He sat down. She pushed the folder across the desk. The next confirmed contact event was not at Erebus. It was in 3 places simultaneously on 2 continents, and the Keth that appeared were not the 3 or 4 of a reconnaissance insertion. 13 sites of contact across the first 18 hours. 47 confirmed encounters in the first week. Whatever Rui's signal had bought them, it had bought them this. 11 months, 2 weeks, 4 days to build something that 12 people on a concrete dock had sketched the blueprint for, with 12 bodies and a handful of metal tiles. The gathering moved. It was not graceful, and it was not, by any honest accounting, adequate. Adequacy was not on the table. What was on the table was the same thing that had always been on the table. The only thing that had ever actually been on the table when the specific situation was. A species, faced with something that had decided they were not worth accounting for. What humans did, when they were not worth accounting for, was this. They accounted for themselves. They found the frequencies and they scattered them. They read the signals that the instruments couldn't read, and they answered them in grammars they were only beginning to understand. They held the components together with their hands. They moved through the maintenance corridors of impossible situations in the dark, counting the seconds, keeping the operative part of their minds working while the animal part screamed. They fought, not gracefully, not with the clean indifference of the Keth, but with the specific messy human quality that had no alien equivalent and no adequate description except this. They did not stop when stopping would have been reasonable. Yua was at the 3rd contact site when it broke. She was not in the field herself. She was running coordination, which meant she was in the same reach-purpose storage unit, but listening now to 12 other frequencies instead of the Pacific, tracking the positions of the right people as they arrived where they needed to be. She was listening when Site 3 went quiet in the bad way, and then 40 seconds later went quiet in the other way. Sato was beside her. He had not fully healed. The wound had left him with a particular way of holding himself, tilted slightly to the right, as if the left side of his body was still deciding whether to commit. But he was there, as he had been there in various forms since Erebus. Because the work he had started 17 months before that night was not finished, and he was constitutionally incapable of leaving unfinished work in other people's hands. He looked at the frequency display. He looked at her. Site 3, she said, I see it. Clean? He was quiet for a moment, then, clean, she exhaled. She had been counting. She was always counting. It had been 9 minutes and 11 seconds since Site 3 last checked in, and clean was the outcome that required 9 minutes and 11 seconds, not the outcome that required less. And so 9 minutes and 11 seconds was the number she had been watching. She thought about the dock. She thought about the amber emergency light, and Sato against the wall with his hand on his wound, and the blue-white alien bioluminescence filling the windows above. She thought about Tetsuya's daughter making art of what terrified her. She thought, that's the thing they didn't plan for. Through the window, the ocean was still there, still enormous, still exactly as enormous as it had always been, with everything that was in it, and everything that crossed it, and everything that looked down from above it and made the calculation about what it found there. She hoped the calculation was harder to make now. She believed it was. Outside, the light was changing. Morning coming to this part of the world, the particular blue-gray that precedes actual dawn, the light that arrives before the light, that does not yet illuminate but announces. She had seen that light on the dock at Erebus, and she had seen it dozens of times since, on dozens of islands that officially had different names, and it still had the quality it had always had. The quality of something held in suspension, waiting to become what it was going to become. Wait, it said. It's coming. Hold on. The frequency display showed sites 1 through 12, 11 of them green. Site 3, newly green. She made a note in the log. Time, outcome, personnel. The record. She thought about what she had told Kigo in the pre-dawn on that dock. Keep making the drawing. Whatever you can see. Whatever you understand. Whatever you don't. She drew it.